For this policy to work well, it needs to be accompanied by a good and workable rewards policy and by good and workable pastoral care. Together, those three things, a good behaviour policy, a good rewards policy, good and effective pastoral care, will help to create a school environment which is safe, which is happy, which is engaging, which is purposeful. And above all, they will help to create a school community in which everybody, pupils and teachers, can excel. Any good behaviour policy is built on 5 basic principles. First of all, it needs to be clear and simple. It needs to be explained in a few bullet points, which can then be displayed in classrooms, can be printed in the student planner and sent home to parents and carers. Secondly, it needs to be consistent and it needs to be fair. Thirdly, where sanctions are involved, it needs to be as immediate as possible. Fourthly, it needs to be incremental. That allows it to deal with whatever offence a pupil may have committed and to deal with that offence appropriately, but it also allows the school to deal with the pupil who doesn't learn the first time. And fifthly, the policy needs to be absolutely non-negotiable. Obviously, it's always beneficial to try and work with parents, to work together with parents, but at the end of the day, the decision to sanction a pupil is the school's decision. And what about the aims of the policy? Well, of course, the first aim of the policy is to protect and to keep safe all members of the school community, adults and pupils alike. The policy needs to reinforce the authority of the teacher, and it also needs to prevent any pupil from intimidating or from upsetting or from disrupting the work of other members of the school community. So let's start with detentions. Now, detentions should be on a sliding scale, starting with 30 minutes and, if possible, without notice. But detentions need to be meaningful. They're not just a time for a pupil to complete homework, though, of course, that may be an appropriate use of a detention. But a detention also needs to be a time when a pupil is forced to think about their poor behaviour and think about the consequences of that behaviour not improving. Detentions also need to be a time when pupils sit there thinking that they would rather not be there. Secondly, isolation. Now, isolation has various advantages. It's immediate, it's public, other pupils see that this poor behaviour will not be tolerated. But again, it will depend on the individual school. It will also depend on the offence that the pupil may have committed. In my first school, isolation was a solitary desk outside my office. In my second school, isolation was 2 fully staffed classrooms. But one of those classrooms was for pupils who had been removed from lessons for being silly and they were there for the day. The other was to provide a different environment, perhaps more specific individual programmes for pupils who had been removed from lessons and from circulation for a longer period of time. Denying a pupil his or her education is a very, very serious step. But if that pupil insists on disrupting the learning of others, of being rude or aggressive or violent, then that pupil has to be removed from the school community. My psychology of exclusion has always been the same as the psychology of prison, that if you cannot live by the rules of a civilised community, then you have to be removed from that community, both to teach you a lesson, but also for the sake of others. Again, my approach to exclusion has always been incremental. For a first serious offence, I should look to exclude for 5 days, for a week. I've never understood, certainly not in a secondary school, the point of excluding a pupil for 1 or 2 days. It's totally meaningless, it devalues the sanction, and the offence could probably far better be dealt with by internal exclusion for a day or 2. If the offence is then repeated, I should look to either exclude for longer or to again issue a 5-day exclusion and then a week or 2 in internal exclusion. And thirdly, if there is a third offence, then I should look to permanent exclusion or to permanent or long-term alternative provision. There has to be an absolute line in the sand. You will not be rude to teachers. You will not be violent. You will not bully. You will not be aggressive. You will obey the rules of the school. So our behaviour policy needs to be clear, it needs to be simple, it needs to be as immediate as possible, it needs to be incremental, and it needs to be absolutely non-negotiable.